Every Friday, I slip into an abandoned version of our world. For so long, I have felt like the only living thing there, but I'm not. It happens every Friday at the stroke of midnight. I slip out of our reality and into one that looks exactly the same, but there are no other people. Then at midnight on Saturday, I slip back into the real world, the one full of life and sound, the one without something lurking in the shadows. This other place is a barren, deserted version of Earth, a liminal space. It bears most man-made and natural elements of present-day Earth, but not a single other person, not a single animal, not even an insect. For a long time, the Friday world's only other signs of life seemed to be swaying trees and plants. Then again, even nature itself has always felt disingenuous in that place. It feels as if the motion of the greenery has been fabricated by something with horrid unknown intent. Every particle of that every atom of that malfunctioning universe whirs in discordance with the next. It is a powder keg, an illusion threatening to fold into itself at any moment. Above all else, it's a lie, every last bit of it. I didn't choose any of this. The nightmare began at midnight on Friday the 8th of December, 2023. A shooting star of blinding blue tore through the black sky above the M5, just outside of Birmingham. When it happened, I was cruising down the motorway on near autopilot, surrounded by dozens of other late-night drivers matching my pace. It has always felt like a tarmac treadmill to me, just an ocean of commuters, rolling endlessly onwards. Our fatigued eyes yanked ever open by the glowing digital billboards on either side of the elevated highway. In such a sleep-deprived state, it's hard to trust eyes, thoughts, and reflexes. It's no wonder, then, that I was startled by the emergence of the sudden light in the sky. It's also no wonder that the shock sent me veering towards the Armco barrier. Several inches of steel which, while solid and sturdy, most likely wouldn't have prevented my car from plummeting off the edge of the raised motorway and meeting a terrible end below. I sometimes daydream about that, being spared all of this horror. Anyhow, the dazzling anomaly filled the sky with incredible blue, stealing my vision for only a second, and then it passed with a blistering trail of unholy light in its wake. Once my eyesight returned, I managed to reassert control over the steering wheel, and I stopped short of colliding with the steel barrier at the edge of the first lane. However, I still chose to slam the brake when I noticed something else, something even more terrifying than my near-death experience. The motorway was empty. Every other driver from my immediate vicinity had vanished. There were no cars, there were no sounds, except for the chugging of my vehicle's running engine. I spent the first few minutes hyperventilating as I tried to get phone service, tried to ring someone, anyone. No signal. After summoning the courage, I threw my door open and placed a foot tentatively onto the tarmac below. There were no vehicles coming towards me. There was no anything. Hence why I'd been so hesitant to leave the safety of my driver's seat. I didn't trust that world. It was all unnatural, unsafe. Still, I had to do something. I wandered over to the second lane and spun in a full circle, eyeing the still shining lights of Birmingham, an eerily dead but illuminated city at night. There was no movement in any direction, Not even a distant vehicle driving along a distant road. And other than my car's running engine, there was still no sound. I started to yell for help. I yelled until my vocal cords snapped and tears poured from my eyes. I wasn't yelling at people, but at the maddening array of pixelated adverts and fully lit buildings at either side of the elevated motorway. I wondered how a city still full of so much man-made light could be so empty. And then, after what must have been 10 minutes of bellowing into the night, came a reply. It was a shrill sound, like an undulating sheet of metal against the wind. What made the piercing shriek chill my blood was that it sounded so close to a human scream. But it was heavily distorted, robotic, cold, unfeeling, and predatory. Yes, predatory. I struggled to shake that thought away. It was the sound of a thing on the hunt. I know that is a bizarre claim, given that I'd only heard a noise, but I didn't need eyes to know what my gut was telling me. After sprinting back to my vehicle and slamming the door closed, my beating heart stilled a little. It's funny that cars make us feel so cozy and shielded, isn't it? In that moment, it seemed as if the source of that wretched shrieking sound wouldn't be able to touch me anymore. Of course, I knew that wasn't true. Unsure as to where I should go or what I should do, I continued driving along the motorway, driving home. As insane as that seems, I felt vulnerable out on that open motorway. Smart prey doesn't sit still. Besides, I still had 5 hours of driving to do. There were miles and miles of land to cross. I think some part of me must have been hoping that, at some point during the journey, I'd come across another living soul, somebody who would help me. Instead, I discovered only a larger void of terror. More deserted villages, towns, and cities. As I passed through residential areas, I did spot a few cars parked on driveways, but there wasn't a single moving vehicle on the roads. Lights still shone through the windows of many buildings, from comfy abodes to hulking skyscrapers. However, I knew that there were no people in those empty husks, so these signs of humanity made the scenery feel all the more haunting. The light felt deceptive and illusory, a red herring. Life was implied, but none could be found. What about that noise? I reminded myself, fingers white-knuckling the steering wheel. About 2 hours into driving, peculiarities started to present themselves. Peculiarities without the beauty of that stunning shooting star. These were sights that, much like the street lamps and kitchen lights illuminating an empty world, filled me only with a well of dread. I emerged from the shadow of a bridge, arching over the motorway, to find that the moon had transformed from a crescent into a full circle. I had to blink my eyes to be sure, but then there was no denying it. That white, orbiting rock had changed in the blink of an eye. I was certain of it. In any other situation, I would have convinced myself that my tired eyes had simply hallucinated the moon being a crescent at all. Yet there was undoubtedly more to this event than that. Next came an impassable junction, shooting off from the motorway's first lane. Impassable not in a worldly sense, but in the sense that the tarmac of the road simply disappeared beneath the bulky roots of several trees. The road slipped like a forgotten rug under a thicket of woodland. It was as if nature had built over it. But even on that first night, I knew that those proud birch trees were like none I'd ever seen on Earth. Initially, I'd been toying with the possibility that the world had ended. However, such strange sightings, such a skew, glitchy rendering of the environment, drove me to believe that something quite different had happened. Something designed. And that mechanical noise was a part of it. That inhuman screech which, when I was about an hour away from home, I heard again. And it wasn't so distant this time. It's following me, I realised in fear. But I saw and heard nothing else during the rest of the drive. I arrived home around 5:30 in the morning. The sun still hadn't risen, but at least most of the lights in my neighbourhood were off. That made things feel a little more natural. It gelled with the emptiness of the world. I prayed to sleep off whatever was happening to me. Prayed that I'd wake up with a pounding headache and find that it had all been a dreadful dream. Yet after I woke with a groggy head in the early afternoon, I walked out of my house to find that the dead world remained. I wandered for a good few hours, but found nothing and no one. My phone had no signal. I couldn't connect to the internet. Everything and everyone had gone. The real world had gone. I was untethered. I spent most of the evening drinking and shuddering fearfully in my living room until passing out around 10ish. When I woke the second time, I was certainly groggier than the day before. In fact, I don't think I would have woken at all if it hadn't been for the rather loud knocking on my front door. Never before, in the midst of a hangover, had such a racket sparked joy in my heart. And when I opened the door to find a postman, I laughed tearfully. It was Saturday, and the world had returned. Of course, I'd lost an entire day, an entire work day. I felt fortunate to work from home on Fridays. I wouldn't get in any trouble. Strange that I'd care about something like that considering what had happened. Then again, my focus on grounded thoughts may well have been a trauma response. In fact, over the course of the following week, I half convinced myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. I considered that I may have actually arrived home on Thursday evening, started glugging brandy, then endured a day-long fever dream. Alcohol-induced fever dream of terrifying proportions on Friday. That prevailing idea started to settle the twist in my belly, and I almost certainly would have believed it for the rest of my life. But then came next Friday. I woke at 7 in the morning, got ready to show my face in the office, as I do from time to time, clambered into my car, and empty roads. I only noticed once I'd driven out of my street. There were no cars. But I made it halfway to the office before fully accepting what my eyes were telling me. It had happened again. And I was stone cold sober, so there was no denying what I was seeing. I drove back and hid in my house. This time I didn't drink. Didn't really do much of anything, but experienced some sort of low-level panic attack for the rest of the day. Then at midnight on Saturday, a burst of sound, car tyres and chattering pedestrians, erupted from the world beyond my window all at once. It tore me from my fetal position on the carpet of the living room. Life had returned. Even the walls of my lounge seemed to regain definition, as if they'd been pale imitations for the past 24 hours. The world was filled with overwhelming colour, a noise once more. I had plenty of missed calls and messages from Friday, as my friends had been expecting me to meet them for a drink, which made me realise that you weren't vanishing from my world. I was vanishing from yours. It kept happening, week after week, month after month. Each Friday started to feel longer, started to feel more like 26 hours, then 30. It's hard to be exact. I was losing my grip on not only time, but my sanity. I'd lost trust in my perception of reality. My head, my whole body, started to ache as time went by. Existing in that alternate world of emptiness seemed to be taking its toll on me. Then several months ago, once my routine, sitting and reading a book in the bedroom for most of each Friday, was down to a fine art, there came a disruption in my predictable schedule. A disruption that stirred me from my evening nap. It was a sound that I hadn't heard since the very first Friday. That metallic, half-human cry. It was horribly familiar, though I'd only heard it once before. It's not possible to forget a sound like that. One so painful, so bent out of shape, so relentlessly grating. It startled me right out of my reading chair and onto my feet. On less than eager legs, I ran to the bedroom window, then used unsteady fingers to poke a peephole through my closed curtains. There was nothing outside. I drew the drapes farther apart, to be sure, and still found nothing. A sigh of relief escaped my lips, but I knew what I'd heard. It hadn't been my imagination. Words don't do the sound justice. That part mechanical, part man sound. And then, as my fingers gripped the curtains to pull them shut, I screamed. A shape poked up from beyond the bottom of the bedroom window. Something was on my front lawn. I found myself staring at the receding hairline of a man's head, a head nearly as wide as the window itself. And as he rose horribly slowly to his feet, the man revealed himself to be a 40 feet tall giant with stretched proportions, as if he'd been elasticated on a medieval rack. The nude creature bore ghostly white, dehydrated skin, covered in stretch marks that seemed to be tearing, and bloodshot eyes that sat at marginally different heights on his elongated face. To my eyes, the figure looked as if he had once been human. Once he had stood to a full height, displaying the lower section of his abdomen in front of the window. The man slammed two slender hands against the pane. Misshapen hands so large that they covered the entirety of the glass. The fright of the motion and sound sent me tumbling onto the bed, mouth agape and wailing in horror. As the pale palm of that abomination kept smacking in a clear attempt to break the window, I scrambled to my feet, then sprinted into the upstairs hallway moments before the glass pane shattered. And when I spun on the upstairs landing, I saw that the tall man had squatted down again, and he was squeezing through the shattered window. Squeezing painfully, made clear by his deformed, tinny screams. The giant crawled into the second floor of my home. Struggled to fit its mammoth skull into my bedroom. I didn't linger for more than a second. I sprinted downstairs, flung the front door open, and beelined towards my car. Once I'd dropped into the driver's seat, feeling deceptively safe in that flimsy box, I looked up at the tall thing lifting its feet off the grass, as its torso wriggled through my upstairs window. And as I looked upon it, the creature paused, then started to reverse. The thing had clearly realised where I'd gone. My key jolted the car awake, and I reversed off the driveway, tyres burning against the gravel. This time there came more than a churn in my gut. There came a migraine. The one that had been worsening over the past couple of months. As I drove down the street, I noticed that the spot behind my eyes throbbed more agonisingly than ever before. I decided that the migraine had been compounded, perhaps, by my fear of the tall man. The tall man who was climbing back out of my bedroom window. Yet, it was spreading through my body. This ache, this unimaginable ache. Such a distracting agony that I only noticed the thumps of titanic footsteps a second before something scratched against the bumper of my car. I looked at my rearview mirror to see that the gaunt, unclothed giant had fallen flat on its long, disproportioned stomach in an attempt to clutch at my vehicle. I had scarcely escaped it. With a primal screech, I stepped more firmly on the accelerator, and then I left my town behind. Left that thing behind. I drove until I ran out of petrol. I made it to Carlisle, as a matter of fact. Then I hid in an empty Travelodge's reception area. From my quivering spot on one of the sofas, I listened to the far-off shrieks of something large and unrelenting. Shrieks that, as the hours ticked by, became not so far off. Around 11, that creature's metallic roar was followed by the sound of metallic crumpling and an almighty thud. Then a car alarm of some vehicle that had clearly been an obstacle in the creature's way. My wet eyes enlarged at the blinking white lights which painted the awning outside the hotel's entrance. The creature, the thing, was close. Throughout that final hour, I counted the minutes, counted the seconds in my head. And then it came. Not the sight of that beast smashing through the hotel's glass doors, but a rush of sound and movement. A blur swept through the lobby, distorting all colours for a moment. Then I found myself in a room no longer empty. Midnight had arrived, along with a hotel receptionist behind the front desk. He was frowning at me, unsurprisingly, given that I had spontaneously appeared out of thin air. "Where did you..." the late-night worker began, before rubbing his eyes. Never mind. Do you need a room, sir?" I shook my head whilst rising from the sofa. Then I hurried outside and walked to a local petrol station. As I walked through the leery streets of Carlisle at midnight, I thought about my situation. Eventually my eyes stopped resisting the urge, and I timidly looked at my aching body below. I nearly choked on my own breath. There was no explaining, but also no denying it. My legs, my arms, all of my extremities, in fact. They all looked 3 or 4 inches longer than the day before. I'd known that. I'd felt it since the stroke of midnight. Felt the change in my body. I just hadn't accepted it until using my eyes. Adrenaline had been jumbling my thoughts. Adrenaline from the horror of being stalked by that thing. Now, of course, there are greater horrors swirling in my mind. Horrifying questions. Was that giant once a man like me? Am I fated to become him?